the late 1950s, America was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The streets were calm. The radios spoke in steady, confident voices. The newspapers reassured families that everything was under control. But beneath that calm surface, fear had already settled deep into the American mind. It was not the kind of fear that caused panic in the streets. It was slower, heavier, more permanent, a fear that followed people home. Parents tucked their children into bed at night, listening to the distant hum of television sets and late-night radio broadcasts. Somewhere, a familiar voice reminded them that the world was changing, and not for the better. Across the country, school children practiced drills they did not fully understand. Duck and cover. They were told to hide beneath their desks, to turn away from the windows, to trust that this simple act could protect them from something no one dared to describe in detail. And yet everyone knew. Something unimaginable was being prepared for. By 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union were closer to nuclear war than at any point in history. Missiles stood ready. Submarines waited in silence. Bombers were fueled and armed. And while the public saw speeches, flags, and confident smiles from Washington, another America was quietly being built. Far from cameras, far from headlines. An America underground. Most citizens were told there was a plan. Government officials spoke of preparedness, of civil defense, of systems designed to protect the population in the event of the unthinkable. Signs began appearing in unexpected places. Small yellow and black symbols on buildings, libraries, schools, and basements. Fallout shelter. They were easy to miss, easy to forget, but they were everywhere. What most Americans did not know, and were never meant to know, was that these shelters were only the visible layer of something far larger, far deeper, and far more selective. Because while the public was being trained to hide under desks and gather canned food, the federal government was quietly constructing a separate world beneath the surface of the nation. A world designed not just to survive nuclear war, but to continue governing afterward. Deep inside mountains, beneath ordinary buildings, hidden behind unmarked doors and anonymous stairwells. There were corridors that stretched farther than city blocks, rooms filled with humming machinery, maps, communication centers, sleeping quarters, and sealed vaults. Places where light was artificial, where time was measured differently, where the outside world could disappear entirely. These were not public shelters. They were not meant for families. They were built for continuity, for power, for those deemed essential. Most Americans assumed that if war ever came, everyone would face it together. That belief was comforting. It was also wrong. Because long before the first sirens would ever sound, decisions had already been made about who would go underground and who would not. Those decisions were never debated in public. They were never voted on, and they were never explained. At the height of the Cold War, the federal government quietly developed something known as continuity of government. The concept was simple and chilling. If Washington were destroyed, the government would not disappear. It would relocate, from the surface to the shadows below. Entire chains of command were planned. Replacement leaders were designated. Emergency powers were outlined. All of it depended on one thing: survival underground. Some of these facilities were enormous. Hidden cities carved into rock, protected by steel doors weighing tons, designed to withstand blasts, radiation, and time itself. Inside, there were hospitals, dormitories, broadcast studios, even chapels. Everything needed to preserve the appearance of normal government, while the rest of the country faced an uncertain fate above ground. And yet, the public was told very little. Too much information, officials believed, would cause panic. Too many questions would weaken confidence, so the truth remained buried, literally. Even today, many Americans who lived through the Cold War have no idea how extensive this underground network really was. They remember the drills, the signs, the constant unspoken tension, but they never saw what lay beneath their feet. And they were never meant to. Because the real story of America's underground bunkers is not just about concrete and steel. It is about fear, about control, and about the quiet decisions made in secret, during a time when the world stood closer to destruction than anyone was ever allowed to admit. By the early 1960s, the United States had already accepted something it would never openly admit. Nuclear war was no longer unthinkable, it was possible. And when something becomes possible, governments stop asking if and begin preparing for when. Publicly, Americans were encouraged to believe that survival would be shared. Families were told to stock basements with canned food and water. Cities painted yellow and black symbols on buildings, marking them as fallout shelters. Pamphlets explained how long to remain indoors, how to seal windows, how to wait. It all felt organized, reassuring, almost fair. But it was only part of the story. Behind closed doors, federal planners were confronting a far more uncomfortable question. What happens after the bombs fall? Who gives orders? Who controls the military? Who speaks to the nation, if the nation still exists? The answer they arrived at was brutally pragmatic. The government must survive, even if much of the country does not. This idea shaped everything that followed. While public shelters were often little more than reinforced basements, stocked with minimal supplies, a completely different class of facilities was being constructed elsewhere. They were larger, stronger, better supplied, and almost entirely invisible. Some were built beneath mountains, chosen not for convenience but for geology. Solid rock offered protection that concrete never could. Entire hillsides were hollowed out. Tunnels reinforced. Massive steel blast doors installed and disguised. From the outside, these places looked ordinary, even boring. Inside, they were something else entirely. The corridors were long and narrow, designed to reduce pressure from explosions. Walls were thick enough to stop radiation. Air filtration systems were installed to operate for weeks, sometimes months, without outside input. Power generators sat ready, fueled and tested. Water systems were sealed. Communication lines ran deep underground, protected from electromagnetic pulses. Everything had been planned. Everything had been calculated. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was not the engineering. It was the selectivity. These bunkers were never intended to shelter millions. They were designed for thousands, sometimes only hundreds. Lists were made, not lists of names, at least not officially, but lists of roles. If nuclear war came, certain positions would be prioritized. Executive branch officials, military commanders, intelligence officers, key technical specialists. The logic was clear. Without them, the country could not function. What that logic quietly implied was something else. Most Americans would not be going underground. They would be left above. This reality was never discussed openly. There were no public debates about fairness, no congressional hearings broadcast on television. The decisions were framed as necessities of survival, cold, efficient, final. In some cases, even the people assigned to these bunkers did not know the full details. Officials were briefed in fragments. Security clearances restricted information. Entire facilities were known only by code names. A person might know where they were meant to go, but not how many others would be left behind. One such facility, hidden deep in rural America, was designed to house a full replacement Congress. Rows of desks sat underground, waiting. Nameplates were prepared. Microphones installed. Broadcast equipment tested. If Washington were destroyed, the illusion of government would continue, unseen, unheard by the public, but intact. Other bunkers served different purposes. Some were command centers, designed to coordinate military response. Others stored critical records, documents deemed too important to lose. There were facilities built solely to ensure communication with submarines beneath the oceans, places where men and women worked in silence, knowing their role might only matter on the worst day in human history. Yet the American people were never shown these places. They were shown diagrams, educational films, reassuring animations. What they were not shown was the reality beneath the surface, because showing it would raise questions. Why were these bunkers so well equipped, while public shelters were not? Why were they hidden so carefully? Why did survival seem to depend on status rather than chance? Questions that had no comfortable answers. So the underground world remained underground, and above it life went on. Children went to school, families watched television, neighbors waved from driveways, all while a parallel America waited silently below their feet. And as the Cold War deepened, one truth became impossible to ignore. The bunkers were not temporary precautions. They were permanent fixtures of a world that had learned to live with the possibility of its own destruction. In October of 1962, the unthinkable came frighteningly close to becoming reality. For 13 days, the world held its breath. American reconnaissance planes photographed Soviet missile sites being constructed in Cuba. Long, unmistakable shadows stretched across the images, evidence that nuclear weapons were being positioned just 90 miles from the United States. In Washington, meetings ran late into the night. Phones rang constantly. Maps were unfolded and refolded. Voices dropped to whispers. Behind the public speeches and carefully chosen words, the machinery of emergency government began to move. For the first time, the underground bunkers were no longer abstract ideas. They were activated. Military command centers shifted into heightened alert. Secure lines were tested repeatedly. Personnel were quietly instructed to prepare for relocation, not evacuation, but continuity. Some officials were told to pack lightly, others were told nothing at all. At the same time, ordinary Americans went about their lives, largely unaware of how close the country stood to catastrophe. Television anchors spoke calmly. Newspapers avoided alarmist language. There were no sirens. But inside classified facilities, the tone was very different. In underground rooms filled with humming equipment, men monitored radar screens and communication channels around the clock. Every signal mattered. Every silence was suspicious. Orders were prepared, not to calm the public but to preserve command. One of the most unsettling aspects of this moment was how quietly it unfolded. There were no mass evacuations to bunkers, no public instructions to seek shelter. That was never the plan. The government's priority was not to save everyone. It was to ensure that someone would remain in control. As the crisis deepened, contingency plans were reviewed in detail. If Washington were struck, designated officials would be transported to secure locations. If communication lines failed, backups would activate. If entire regions were lost, replacements would assume authority. All of this depended on a simple assumption, that the underground world would remain intact. Inside certain bunkers, preparations reached a final stage. Beds were made, supplies inventoried, schedules posted. These places were no longer construction projects or emergency backups. They were operational. What makes this moment especially chilling is not what happened, but what didn't. The public was never informed of how close the system came to being used. There was no announcement explaining how government survival would work. No acknowledgement of the moral weight of those decisions. When the crisis passed, life simply returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. Behind the scenes, something had changed. The people who had stood inside those bunkers now understood that nuclear war was not a theoretical risk. It was a matter of timing, and timing could not be trusted. From that moment forward, the underground network expanded. Facilities were improved, systems modernized, security tightened. If the world nearly ended once, it could happen again. Some bunkers were upgraded to withstand stronger blasts. Others were expanded to house additional personnel. New sites were quietly commissioned, not announced, not debated, just built. For the public, the Cold War continued as a background tension, something discussed in headlines, speeches, and films. For those involved in continuity planning, it became a daily reality. Every drill was taken seriously. Every update mattered, because they had seen how close the world could come to silence. And while Americans slept in their homes, confident that leaders were keeping them safe, those leaders had already accepted a darker truth. There might come a day when safety meant separation, when the surface would be abandoned, and the future of the nation would exist only underground. As the Cold War stretched on through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, America slowly learned how to live with permanent uncertainty. The headlines changed. Presidents came and went. Wars were fought far from home. But the underground world never stopped evolving. Inside the bunkers, planners began to ask a question few people on the surface ever considered. What would life actually be like down here? Survival was not just about avoiding the blast. It was about endurance. Days, weeks, months, possibly longer. Engineers studied human behavior as closely as they studied concrete and steel. How long could people remain underground before stress took over? How much light was needed to prevent psychological collapse? How much silence was too much? Artificial day-night cycles were introduced. Lights dimmed and brightened on strict schedules. Clocks were synchronized to create the illusion of normal time. Sleeping quarters were small, efficient. There was no privacy in the traditional sense. Every space served a function. Bunk beds lined narrow rooms. Personal belongings were limited to what could be justified as necessary. Comfort was considered a luxury, and luxury was dangerous. Food was another carefully calculated variable. Meals were designed to be filling, not enjoyable. Calories mattered more than taste. Menus were repetitive by design. Familiarity reduced conflict. Even boredom was preferable to unpredictability. Medical facilities were equipped to handle emergencies, but not everything. Doctors were trained to work with limited supplies. Serious conditions raised uncomfortable questions. Who would receive treatment? Who would wait? Who might not survive? These questions were never written into manuals. They were understood. Perhaps the most revealing spaces inside these bunkers were not the sleeping areas or command rooms. They were the communication centers. From deep underground, officials could broadcast messages to the nation, or what remained of it. Scripts were prepared in advance, messages of reassurance, of continuity, of resolve. Even if cities were gone, the voice of authority would remain. At least that was the plan. But there was a contradiction at the heart of the system. The government was preparing to speak to a public that might no longer exist, and no one knew how long that contradiction could be maintained. As years passed without catastrophe, many of these bunkers slipped into a strange state of limbo. They were too important to abandon, too expensive to dismantle, too secret to discuss. Maintenance crews rotated in and out. Systems were tested quietly. Security remained tight. Above ground, people forgot. Below ground, readiness never truly faded. Some officials who visited these facilities later described an unsettling feeling. A sense that the bunkers were not just shelters, but waiting rooms. Places designed for a future no one wanted to imagine, but no one dared to ignore. The longer the Cold War lasted, the more the underground world began to feel permanent. Not a temporary response to crisis, but an accepted feature of modern civilization. By the time tensions began to ease in the late 1980s, entire careers had been spent preparing for a day that never came. People had trained for decades to disappear underground at a moment's notice. They retired without ever using the skills they had perfected. And the bunkers remained. Silent, ready, patient. When the Cold War finally began to fade, it did not end with an explosion or a surrender. It ended quietly. Walls came down. Treaties were signed. Television screens filled with images of handshakes and speeches about peace. For most Americans, it felt like a long nightmare slowly dissolving into memory. But underground, nothing disappeared. The bunkers were still there, fully stocked, fully wired, fully sealed. They had not been built for a single enemy or a single decade. They had been built for uncertainty itself. As budgets shifted and priorities changed, many of these facilities entered a strange afterlife. Some were placed on standby. Others were quietly downgraded. A few were officially decommissioned, but very few were truly abandoned. The reason was simple. No one could say with confidence that the world would never return to the edge. Inside government agencies, the language changed, but the logic did not. Nuclear war became global catastrophe. Continuity of government became emergency preparedness. The structures remained the same, only the labels were adjusted. In some cases, the existence of these bunkers slowly leaked into public awareness. Journalists uncovered fragments. Former officials spoke carefully years after retirement. Photographs surfaced. What people saw was unsettling. Facilities far larger and more advanced than anything the public had imagined. Rooms that looked frozen in time. Desks still arranged, phones still mounted, signs still posted, as if the occupants had stepped away expecting to return. For many Americans who lived through the Cold War, these revelations were deeply uncomfortable. They raised questions that had been suppressed for decades. Why was so much effort spent protecting the system, and so little spent protecting the people? Who decided who was essential? And what did survival really mean? Some defended the logic. A nation, they argued, cannot function without leadership. Order must be preserved. Chaos must be avoided. Others were less convinced. They saw the bunkers as symbols of distance, not safety. Evidence of how far decision-makers were willing to separate themselves from those they governed. What made these discoveries especially haunting was their familiarity. These facilities had existed all along, beneath towns, beneath highways, beneath ordinary landscapes. Americans had driven over them, walked above them, lived their lives unaware. In some places, the bunkers were repurposed, converted into storage facilities, data centers, museums. But even when stripped of their original function, something lingered, a sense that these spaces were never meant to be casual. They had been built for the worst version of the future. And perhaps the most unsettling realization was this. The end of the Cold War did not make the bunkers obsolete. It merely made them quieter. Because the world had learned a lesson it could not unlearn. Civilization was fragile. Order was conditional. And preparation often happened far from public view. By the time a new century arrived, the underground world was no longer discussed in terms of fear. It was discussed in terms of prudence. Just in case. And so the bunkers waited. Not as relics of paranoia, but as reminders of a time when survival was planned, selectively, silently, and beneath the surface. In the end, America's underground bunkers were never just about survival. They were about certainty. In a world where nothing could be guaranteed, these hidden spaces represented control, the belief that order could be preserved even when everything else collapsed. For decades, the American public was encouraged to trust the government, trust the system, trust that someone somewhere had a plan. And in a way, that trust was not misplaced. There was a plan. It simply was not designed for everyone. The bunkers were built on a difficult assumption that society could be reduced to its essential components. That leadership mattered more than numbers. That continuity mattered more than fairness. These were not moral judgments. They were strategic ones. For the men and women who designed these systems, the logic was clear. If the nation survived, even in a diminished form, then recovery was possible. If leadership vanished, chaos would follow. And chaos, they believed, would be worse than any bomb. But this logic came at a cost. It required secrecy. It required silence. And it required the acceptance that millions might be left without protection. That truth was never spoken aloud. It did not need to be. Even today, many of these bunkers remain sealed, maintained, and ready. Their exact locations are still classified, their capacity still unknown, their intended occupants still unnamed. They exist as quiet insurance policies against a future no one wants to imagine. What makes their story unsettling is not the concrete, the steel, or the technology. It is the reminder that fear once shaped an entire nation's hidden architecture. That beneath everyday life, there existed a parallel world built for a moment of ultimate failure. For those who lived through the Cold War, this realization often brings mixed emotions. Relief, that the bunkers were never needed. Unease, that they were prepared at all. And a lingering question that has never fully gone away. If disaster ever comes again, Who will be invited underground? The signs on public buildings have faded. The drills have stopped. The films have been forgotten. But the structures remain. Silent. Waiting. Just beneath the surface. Because while history may move forward, some plans are never truly abandoned. They are simply buried.